I want to tell you about the afternoon I returned to our wedding venue for a forgotten garment bag, because that small mistake kept me from signing my name onto a crime. 12 days before my wedding, I stood behind a linen curtain and listened to my fiancé's best man explain how they would use our marriage before the flowers had even wilted. My name is Claire Bennett. I was 36 then, a major in the United States Army, and I had spent most of my career in digital forensics and procurement-fraud analysis. I did not carry a rifle into dangerous places. I followed money, metadata, altered contracts, and the quiet electronic fingerprints people leave when they believe nobody is looking. My fiancé, Evan Hale, was 39 and owned a fast-growing logistics company called Hale Meridian. He was polished without seeming rehearsed, generous without making a performance of it, and attentive in a way that made people feel chosen. When he entered a room, he remembered every name. When he held my hand, I believed I had finally found peace. Evan knew I was an Army officer, but he believed I managed personnel records and routine compliance paperwork. I had never corrected him in detail. Some parts of my work were sensitive, and discretion had become second nature. I told myself there was no harm in letting the man I loved think my days were filled with forms, briefings, and harmless spreadsheets. We had been together for 2 years and engaged for 8 months. The wedding was scheduled at a restored estate outside Richmond, with white roses, navy ribbons, and nearly 180 guests. Evan handled the vendors because he said my schedule was demanding. At the time, I thought his eagerness was devotion. Later, I understood it was access. That Thursday, I had attended our final venue walkthrough before driving toward base. Halfway across town, the seamstress called to say, my mother's garment bag was still hanging in the bridal suite. I turned around, irritated but calm, expecting to be inside for less than 2 minutes. The estate looked empty when I parked near the kitchen entrance. I used the side door the coordinator had given us permission to use. As I crossed the service hallway, I heard Evan's best man, Lucas Dane, speaking in the reception room. His tone was low and amused. I almost announced myself, but then he said, once the vows are done, her veteran status becomes the cleanest doorway we've ever had. My feet stopped moving. Evan answered from somewhere near the windows. He told Lucas that the ownership papers would be signed during the honeymoon, framed as a tax adjustment for married couples. Lucas asked whether I might read them carefully. Evan laughed and said, I spent my life pushing Army paperwork, so a stack of corporate forms would make me impatient enough to sign wherever he pointed. Then Lucas mentioned a federal transportation contract, worth $42 million. He said my name would give their new company the veteran-controlled ownership percentage it needed to qualify. Evan replied that I would never understand the structure until the money had moved, and by then the debt, the guarantees, and the liability would all be attached to me. The sentence that changed everything came next. Evan said, by our first anniversary, Claire will either cooperate or look unstable. Either way, we keep the contract. He said it with the same warm voice he used when asking how I took my coffee. I stood behind that curtain, one hand over my mouth, while 12 years of training replaced shock with procedure. I took out my phone, started an audio recording, and remained still. Lucas described shell companies, a friendly accountant, and a bank officer willing to treat my future signature as routine. Evan discussed refinancing my townhouse after adding his name to the deed. They were not improvising. They were reviewing a schedule, and my wedding date was simply the first deadline. I did not confront them. I waited until their voices moved toward the terrace, slipped back through the service hallway, collected the garment bag, and left through the kitchen. My hands did not begin shaking until I locked the car doors. Even then, I did not cry. I labeled the recording with the date and time, copied it twice, and drove to base. For the next 4 hours, I performed my job by muscle memory. I answered messages, reviewed an evidence memo, and attended a briefing without hearing half of it. Near sunset, I closed my office door and listened to the recording through secure headphones. The first time I heard betrayal. The second time I heard conspiracy. The third time I heard evidence. I called a civilian attorney named Miriam Cole, whom I knew through a military spouse legal seminar. I told her I needed advice involving identity misuse, business formation, and a marriage that had not yet happened. She asked whether I was safe, whether Evan had access to my devices, and whether I could meet without alerting him. I answered yes to all three. Miriam listened to the recording in her office the next morning. She did not interrupt or react. When it ended, she asked me to repeat exactly what Evan knew about my assets, my credit, my service history, and my signatures. Then she said the plan sounded less like marital manipulation and more like a prepared procurement fraud scheme, using me as the qualifying owner. Miriam warned me not to search restricted databases, use Army systems, or investigate through my official role. I agreed immediately. Everything we did would remain civilian, lawful, and independently documented. She referred me to Jonah Price, a former state financial crimes detective who now conducted licensed corporate due diligence and asset tracing work. Jonah began with public records. Within 48 hours, he found 3 limited liability companies created during the previous 9 months. One used an address connected to Lucas. Another listed Evan's mother, Diane, as the registered agent. The third contained my full legal name in a draft filing that had been submitted, rejected for a technical defect, and quietly resubmitted. I stared at that filing longer than I want to admit. Someone had typed my name beside the title Managing Veteran Member without my knowledge. The signature block was blank, but my date of birth, former mailing address, and service branch were correct. Those details had not come from a random internet search. They had come from documents inside my home. Jonah next uncovered Evan's debt. Hale Meridian looked successful from the outside, but court records showed equipment liens, unpaid fuel accounts, and 2 private loans in default. The company owed nearly $3 million, much of it personally guaranteed by Evan. A large federal award would not make him wealthy. It would keep his collapsing business alive. The pattern became clearer when Jonah found a former girlfriend named Rachel Monroe. 4 years earlier, she had become the 51% owner of a small medical supply company. Shortly before that company won a state contract. 8 months later, the business failed, Rachel filed bankruptcy, and Evan disappeared from every document despite having controlled the operations. Rachel had never accused him publicly. Through her attorney, Miriam sent a careful message asking whether she would speak confidentially. Rachel agreed only after learning that another woman might be at risk. When we met, she brought a banker box filled with contracts she had been too ashamed to open for years. Her hands shook when she placed it on the table. She told us Evan had called her his partner, his future, and the only person he trusted. He persuaded her to sign ownership papers because a woman-led company would have a stronger chance at certain contracts. He promised she would never handle operations. When the invoices stopped matching deliveries, he told clients she had made every decision and left her holding the debt. That night, I went home and found Evan cooking dinner. He kissed my forehead, poured me wine, and asked whether the venue had found the garment bag. I said yes. He smiled without hesitation. I watched him chop rosemary and talk about our honeymoon, while the recording of his real plan sat encrypted on 3 separate drives less than 10 feet away. I began observing him the way I had observed suspects in interview rooms. He asked casual questions about my veteran benefits, my credit score, and whether my townhouse had appreciated. He suggested we open a joint business account for future investments. Each question arrived wrapped in affection, and each answer I gave was vague enough to sound ordinary. 2 days later, Diane invited me to lunch. She praised my discipline, called me the daughter she had always wanted, and then produced a leather folder from her handbag. Inside were proposed estate documents, a deed amendment, and a packet for a new consulting company. She said successful couples organize these things before marriage, so emotion would never interfere later. I told her I wanted Miriam to review everything. Diane's smile held, but only barely. She said lawyers complicated simple matters and charged people to distrust those who loved them. Then she touched my hand and added, "Evan needs to know you are truly on his team." I heard the threat beneath the tenderness and thanked her for caring so much. After lunch, I photographed every page in the parking lot before returning the folder exactly as I had received it. Miriam found clauses giving Evan practical control of the proposed company, while leaving me with voting ownership and personal guarantees. The deed amendment would have allowed a refinancing package tied to business debt. The documents were a trap with elegant margins. At that point, I could have ended the engagement, changed the locks, and walked away. Miriam encouraged me to consider safety before justice. But Rachel's box of ruined years sat in my mind. If I vanished quietly, Evan would adjust the paperwork, choose someone else, and repeat the pattern. I wanted to stop the mechanism, not merely remove myself from it. I also knew that staying carried risk. Evan was not physically violent as far as we knew, but people become unpredictable when control slips. We built a safety plan. My friend Tessa received a sealed envelope with copies of the recording and documents. I changed every password, froze my credit, moved irreplaceable items, and arranged a place to sleep within minutes if necessary. Miriam contacted the appropriate civilian authorities and an inspector connected to federal small business contracting. I made a formal disclosure through my chain of command because my name and military status were being used in a proposed government bid. I was immediately screened from anything touching the matter. For the first time in my career, I became a witness instead of an analyst. The inspector, Special Agent Nora Bell, was calm and precise. She told me not to provoke Evan, promise cooperation beyond what was safe, or create evidence that did not already exist. Our goal was not a dramatic wedding scene. It was to preserve an existing scheme long enough for investigators to establish intent, participants, and the actual movement of documents. The next week became an exercise in controlled normality. I attended a cake tasting, approved place cards, and laughed when Lucas joked that marriage was the most expensive merger Evan would ever close. He did not know I had heard him use that exact word at the venue. I smiled and asked whether he preferred chocolate or lemon filling. Evan soon brought home a laptop and said he had prepared a surprise wedding gift, a consulting company we could build together after I left active service. He opened a presentation showing my name, military biography, and a projected contract pipeline. He described me as the public face and himself as the operational brain. He called it our legacy. I asked why my name appeared on documents before I had agreed. For half a second, his expression emptied. Then he laughed, kissed my temple, and said his attorney had created placeholders to save time. He assured me nothing was official without my signature. That was a lie, and because I already had the rejected filing, it was a lie we could prove. I told him the idea sounded exciting, but that I wanted to understand the numbers. He looked delighted, not alarmed. Predators are often most relaxed when the target steps willingly toward the trap. He emailed me a sanitized business plan that evening. Hidden in the document history were earlier authors, tracked revisions, and references to a folder labeled Claire Conversion. I forwarded the original file to Miriam and Nora without opening it on any government system. The metadata linked Lucas, Diane, and an accountant named Peter Voss to versions created months before our engagement announcement. One comment read, "Need marriage completed before beneficial owner certification." Another said, "Keep her away from operational email until award." Miriam moved quickly to protect me. My townhouse went into a properly structured trust. My accounts were retitled where appropriate, and fraud alerts were placed with every institution that mattered. We also filed identity theft documentation regarding the unauthorized business submission. By the time Evan presented his final forms, the assets he wanted were already beyond his reach. I did not sign the dangerous documents. Instead, Miriam prepared a harmless acknowledgement, stating only that I had received draft materials for an independent review. The pages resembled the packet Evan expected, but the operative language granted no ownership, authority, guarantee, or power of attorney. I signed each page in front of him and watched relief soften his shoulders. The investigation deepened. A court-authorized process revealed communications between Lucas and Peter discussing invoice inflation, subcontractor kickbacks, and the use of my credit to secure equipment leases. Diane had arranged introductions to 2 lenders, and referred to me in messages as the uniform. Nobody used my name when they spoke about what I could provide. Rachel agreed to give a formal statement. She identified the same accountant, the same lender, and nearly identical language in documents from her failed company. Her old email archive contained messages in which Evan directed operations while instructing others to keep his name off ownership records. The pattern was no longer emotional history. It was corroboration. Then another woman came forward. Her name was Simone Patel, a former Army nurse who had dated Lucas, not Evan. Lucas had persuaded her to lend her resume and veteran credentials to a disaster response startup. The company never won a contract, but Simone discovered loans opened in its name and spent 2 years proving she had not authorized them. 3 days before the rehearsal dinner, Evan became restless. He asked whether I had spoken to an attorney and whether anyone at work had contacted me about the new company. I said wedding paperwork had consumed all my attention. He studied my face for a long second, then smiled and told me he admired how uncomplicated I could be. That night, I found the drawer of my desk slightly open. Nothing obvious was missing, but the tiny paper fiber I had placed across the inside edge was broken. Evan had searched it. Fortunately, the folder inside contained decoy bank statements and a flash drive prepared for exactly that possibility. The drive held no sensitive material, only a logging program authorized by investigators. When Evan connected the drive to his laptop, it recorded the device identity and the folders he attempted to access. He searched for my tax returns, property records, military resume, and a document titled Security Clearance Verification. The attempt did not give him classified information, but it proved he was seeking credentials far beyond anything needed for a marriage. I slept in the same bed with him that night, staring at the ceiling while his breathing settled beside me. That was the hardest part of the entire operation. Not the wedding, not the recording, not the legal meetings. It was lying inches from a man who believed my identity was an inventory and forcing my body not to reveal that I knew. The next morning, I told Tessa everything. She had been my closest friend since officer training and was supposed to stand beside me as maid of honor. At first, she thought I was describing cold feet. Then I played the recording. Her face changed slowly, the way a room changes when the power fails. She asked why the wedding was still happening. I explained that the ceremony itself was not required for the case, but the scheduled business meeting after it was. Evan had invited Lucas, Peter, Diane, and 2 lenders to a private brunch the morning after our wedding, where he intended to finalize ownership certifications. Investigators wanted the participants together, using the documents they had prepared. I told my parents only that serious legal information had emerged, and that they must trust me during the ceremony. My mother cried in the kitchen, not because she doubted me, but because she suddenly understood why I had seemed distant. My father asked one question. "Do you need me beside you or out of the way?" I said beside me. The rehearsal dinner took place in a candlelit room overlooking the river. Evan toasted loyalty, partnership, and the courage required to build a future together. Lucas raised his glass and called me the final piece of the Hale Meridian family. Around us, guests applauded. I looked at the men who had reduced me to a qualification code and smiled for photographs. Later, Evan pulled me onto the terrace. He said he knew I was nervous and promised that after the wedding I would never need to worry about work again. I asked whether he loved me even if I refused to join his company. His answer came too quickly. He said of course, then spent 10 minutes explaining why refusal would hurt everything we had planned. I asked him one final question. I said, "What exactly do I do in the Army?" He laughed and said I kept records, managed audits, and made sure forms went to the right desk. I realized then that he had never truly asked. He had heard the least important version of my life and accepted it, because he believed that version was easier to control. On the morning of the wedding, I dressed in a quiet room with Tessa and my mother. My gown was simple, with long sleeves and no train. Outside, rain touched the windows in soft bursts. I did not feel like a bride. I felt like a witness preparing to enter a hearing where the most intimate evidence of my life would become public. Before the ceremony, Evans signed what he believed was a routine acknowledgement for the post-wedding business brunch. The page confirmed that the ownership materials had been prepared before my independent approval, and that he intended to submit them once our marriage was complete. He signed without reading, using the same carelessness he expected from me. My father offered his arm. He did not tell me to be brave. He knew bravery was not the issue. The doors opened, and we walked past friends, relatives, soldiers, business partners, and people who had traveled across states to celebrate a future that had never existed. Every step carried me farther from the lie and closer to the truth. At the altar, Evan took my hands and whispered that I looked perfect. His palms were warm. His smile did not tremble. The officiant welcomed everyone and spoke about trust as the foundation of marriage. I almost laughed at the cruelty of the word, but instead I looked at Evan and let him believe the ceremony was proceeding exactly as planned. When the officiant asked whether we were prepared to make our vows, I said I needed to share something first. Evan's smile tightened, then recovered. He assumed I had written a personal tribute. I turned toward the guests and said that 12 days earlier, I had overheard a conversation at this estate that changed the meaning of every promise in the room. I asked the coordinator to lower the lights. A screen behind the flowers illuminated, showing the rejected company filing with my name, listed as managing veteran member. Murmurs moved through the chapel. Then the audio began. Lucas's voice explained the contract. Evan's voice described the honeymoon signatures, my house, and the plan to make me appear unstable. The recording lasted less than 3 minutes, but time became strange inside that room. Evan released my hands. Lucas stood halfway from his chair and sat again. Diane stared at the floor. When Evan's recorded voice said, "By our first anniversary, we keep the contract," my mother made a sound behind me that I had never heard from her before. Evan reached for the microphone and said the conversation was a joke taken out of context. I asked him to explain the business filing. He said it was only a draft. Miriam stepped forward and displayed the metadata, revision history, lender correspondence, and the acknowledgement Evan had signed that morning, confirming when the materials were prepared. For the first time since I had known him, Evan looked ordinary. Not charming, not controlled, not dangerous, just frightened. He asked me to stop and discuss everything privately. I told him privacy was what had protected the scheme before me. Rachel and Simone then stood from the second row, each accompanied by counsel, and the room went completely silent. Rachel spoke first. She said Evan had used the same promises, the same accountant, and the same ownership structure to leave her bankrupt. Simone said Lucas had used her veteran record to open accounts she never controlled. Neither woman raised her voice. They did not need to. Their calm made denial sound smaller than anger ever could. Nora and her colleagues approached after the statements were complete. She identified herself, explained that court-authorized actions were underway, and asked Evan, Lucas, Peter, and Diane to remain available for separate interviews. No one was handcuffed at the altar. The law is rarely as theatrical as people imagine, but its quiet arrival can still empty a room of oxygen. Lucas moved toward a side door and stopped when another investigator appeared there. Peter began insisting he was only an accountant following client instructions. Diane said nothing at all. Evan looked at me as if betrayal were something I had done to him. He whispered, "You set me up," I answered. "No. I finally read what you wrote." The officiant announced that no marriage had taken place and that no license would be submitted. My father stepped beside me. Tessa removed the bouquet from my hands because I had begun gripping the stems hard enough to cut my palm. Around us, guests remained seated, uncertain whether leaving would be respectful or cowardly. My mother reached me last. She wrapped both arms around my shoulders and apologized for every moment she had praised Evan, as though his deception were somehow her failure. I told her it was not. That distinction mattered. Trust is not foolishness. The shame belongs to the person who weaponizes it, not to the person who offered it honestly. I left the chapel through the same side hallway where I had first heard Lucas. Outside, a plain sedan waited to take me to a secure location for the night while search warrants were executed. I was still wearing my wedding dress. As the estate disappeared behind us, I felt no victory, only the exhausted relief of someone who had stepped away from a closing door. The next weeks were quieter than the wedding and more difficult. Investigators seized business records, laptops, and phones from Hale Meridian and related companies. My name appeared in draft contracts, lender packets, and internal projections dating back nearly a year. Evan had begun building the scheme before he proposed to me. I changed the locks, installed cameras, and returned every item Evan had left in my townhouse through counsel. The engagement ring remained in an evidence envelope because it had been purchased through a business account connected to the scheme. Even the symbol of our promise had been entered as an expense on a company he intended to place in my name. Rachel's case was reopened through civil proceedings, and Simone's identity theft dispute gained new evidence. Other former employees contacted investigators after seeing the reports. One described shipments billed but never delivered. Another produced emails about keeping qualified owners away from actual decision-making. The conspiracy grew larger than any of us had expected. Months later, a grand jury returned indictments involving wire fraud, false statements, identity misuse, and conspiracy. I will not pretend the legal process was fast or clean. Motions followed, hearings were delayed, and every headline reopened wounds I wanted closed. Accountability is not a single dramatic moment. It is paperwork, patience, and repeated truth. Diane eventually agreed to cooperate. Through her attorney, she admitted arranging lenders and gathering personal documents from women Evan and Lucas targeted. Her cooperation did not erase what she had done, but it revealed the full system. Prospects were evaluated for credit, credentials, property, and emotional isolation before relationships became serious. Evan contacted me once through attorneys with an offer to explain. He said pressure from debt had changed him, and that some part of his love for me had been real. I declined the meeting. A feeling does not become innocent because it existed beside a plan. Whatever affection he carried had never outweighed his willingness to destroy my life. The criminal case eventually ended in negotiated pleas for several defendants, while others continued to contest charges. Evan admitted to false ownership representations and coordinated financial deception. The sentence was not as long as some people expected, and longer than he believed he deserved. For me, the number mattered less than the public record of what happened. Restitution proceedings helped Rachel recover part of what she had lost, though no judgment could return the years she spent believing she had been stupid. Simone cleared the final disputed accounts from her credit history. We remained in touch, not as a dramatic sisterhood, but as three women who understood the same language, without needing every sentence explained. I returned to duty after a short period of leave. Because I had disclosed the conflict immediately and avoided using official resources, my career survived intact. I was recused from related matters and cooperated only as a witness. My colleagues offered the kinds of support soldiers understand best: coffee, quiet company, and no questions I was not ready to answer. For a while, ordinary kindness made me suspicious. A remembered birthday, a thoughtful gift, or a question about my work could tighten something in my chest. Therapy helped me separate attentiveness from surveillance and privacy from secrecy. I did not want Evan's choices to turn caution into a permanent inability to receive care. I donated the wedding dress to an organization that provided formal clothing to military families. Before I sealed the box, I touched the sleeve and remembered standing at the altar. The dress had not failed me. It had simply been present when I chose myself. I wanted its next meaning to belong to someone whose celebration was honest. People often ask how I missed the warning signs when detecting deception was my profession. The answer is uncomfortable but simple. Expertise is not immunity. At work, I had authority, distance, and verified data. At home, I had affection, hope, and a man who understood that trust makes ordinary behavior feel safe until a pattern becomes visible. The most dangerous lie Evan told was not about the contract, the debt, or the company. It was the story that love meant making complicated things easy by letting him handle them. Real partnership does not ask you to surrender comprehension. It slows down, welcomes independent advice, and remains patient when you read every page. I have since spoken to service members and veterans about financial grooming in relationships. I never share operational details from my case, but I tell them to protect original documents, review business filings, maintain independent access to money, and treat pressure around signatures as information. Romance does not suspend due diligence. A year after the wedding that never happened, I returned to the estate alone. The coordinator met me near the service hallway and apologized for not noticing the private meeting. I told her she had nothing to apologize for. Then I stood beside the linen curtain where I had first heard Lucas and felt surprised by how small the space was. For months, that hallway had occupied the size of a battlefield in my memory. In reality, it was 12 feet long, with beige walls and a brass cart holding folded napkins. Places do not keep the power we assign them forever. Sometimes healing is simply returning and discovering that the room did not grow. You did. I never recovered the version of myself who trusted without checking. I am not sure I want to. What replaced her is not colder, only more deliberate. I can love someone and still read the document. I can believe a promise and still verify the structure around it. Caution does not cancel tenderness, it gives tenderness boundaries. 2 years later, I met someone through friends. On our third date, he asked what I actually did in the army. I gave him the broad, unclassified truth and watched to see whether he seemed impressed, threatened, or bored. He asked thoughtful questions, accepted the limits of what I could discuss, and never once treated my career as a tool he might use. We moved slowly. There were no grand gestures, no urgent financial plans, and no declarations designed to outrun judgment. When we eventually discussed money, he suggested separate attorneys before I could. That small sentence affected me more than flowers ever had. Safety can sound surprisingly ordinary when you have known the polished language of control. I do not tell this story because my military training made me invincible. It did not. I tell it because the training gave me a pause between shock and action, and that pause gave other people time to help. The recording mattered. The lawyers mattered. Rachel, Simone, Tessa, my parents, and the investigators mattered just as much. I think often about what would have happened if I had remembered the garment bag. I would have driven to base, married Evan 12 days later, and probably signed the ownership packet during our honeymoon. By the time the contract failed or investigators arrived, my name would have been printed above decisions I had never made. That possibility still chills me, but it no longer controls me. The forgotten bag was chance. Everything after it was choice. To listen, preserve evidence, seek counsel, disclose the conflict, protect myself, and refuse to disappear quietly. Luck opened the curtain. Discipline kept me standing behind it long enough to understand what I heard. Evan once believed my work was only paperwork. In one narrow sense, he was right. Paperwork saved me. Filings, metadata, acknowledgments, trusts, affidavits, and recorded dates turned a private warning into a provable pattern. People mock documents until a document becomes the line between a story someone can deny and a fact they must answer. My father still keeps the tie he wore to the ceremony in the back of his closet. He says it reminds him that walking someone down an aisle does not always mean giving her away. Sometimes it means standing close enough for her to turn around safely. I have never heard a better description of what family did for me that day. My mother eventually stopped apologizing for loving Evan before she knew the truth. She began volunteering with a local financial abuse nonprofit, helping older adults organize records and find legal support. She says action is where she puts the guilt she no longer deserves to carry. I understand that instinct better than anyone. Rachel started a new business with her sister, this time with transparent books, and an attorney she chose herself. Simone completed the home purchase she had delayed while repairing her credit. Their victories were not dramatic, but they were real. Recovery often looks like ordinary paperwork, finally carrying your own decisions instead of someone else's. As for Hale Meridian, the name disappeared from office doors and contract databases. Companies can vanish faster than the damage they create. What remains are the records, the restitution orders, and the people who learn to speak. Silence had been part of the business model. Once that ended, the rest of the structure could not hold. The lesson I carry is not that love is dangerous. Love is not the threat. Entitlement disguised as care is the threat. Urgency disguised as protection is the threat. A partner who needs your signature more than your understanding is telling you exactly what the relationship is worth to them, even when the words sound tender. I still keep the original audio file in an encrypted archive. I have not listened to it in years. I do not need to. The voice I remember most is not Evan's or Lucas's. It is my own at the altar, steady enough to say that the ceremony could not continue. That was the moment I stopped being evidence in their plan and became the author of mine. Some people told me I should have exposed him privately to spare both families the humiliation. I understand why they say that. But secrecy had already protected him through other women, other companies, and other debts. Public truth was not punishment for its own sake. It was the condition that allowed witnesses to recognize one another. Others asked whether I enjoyed watching his face change. I did not. There was no pleasure in seeing a future collapse, even a fraudulent one. What I felt was clarity. The man at the altar was the same man behind the curtain. Only the audience had changed. Once everyone could hear the plan, his charm had nowhere left to hide it. Today, when a young officer tells me she feels embarrassed for trusting the wrong person, I remind her that deception is designed to be believed. The correct response is not self-contempt. It is documentation, support, and distance. Shame isolates the person who was targeted. Facts return the weight to the person who created the lie. I am grateful for the garment bag, though that sounds strange. I am more grateful for the habits that followed. Checking the timestamp, making copies, calling counsel, and refusing to improvise revenge. The difference between escape and accountability was not that I was smarter than Evan. It was that I stopped facing him alone. So that is the story of the wedding where I never said my vows, the company I never owned, and the future someone else had already budgeted in my name. I went to the estate expecting to retrieve a piece of clothing. I left carrying the first proof that the man I loved had mistaken my trust for consent. If any part of this story stays with you, let it be this. Read the page, keep your own copies, and never confuse pressure with partnership. The right person will not be threatened by your understanding. They will want you to know exactly what you are signing, exactly what you are sharing, and exactly who remains responsible. Thank you for staying with me through the whole story. Tell me which moment changed your view of Evan, and where you are listening from tonight. There are more stories about betrayal, hidden strength, and the quiet decisions that save a life. Subscribe if you want to hear the next one when it arrives.